Chapter 3. Mr. Collins visits Longbourn. "I hope, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife at breakfast the next morning, "that you have told the cook to send up a good dinner today, as I am expecting a visitor."
"Who is it, my dear? I know of nobody who is coming, unless Charlotte Lucas happens to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her."
"The person I'm talking about is a gentleman and a stranger." Mrs. Bennet's eyes shone with excitement.
"It's Mr. Bingley, I'm sure. Why, Jane, you never mentioned it. Well, I'll be extremely glad to see him. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to the cook at once."
"It is not Mr. Bingley," said her husband. "It's a person whom I have never seen before." This caused general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters all at the same time. Having amused himself for some time with their curiosity, he finally explained. "I have recently received a letter from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, as you know, will inherit all my property when I die, and may throw you out of this house as soon as he wants."
"Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "please don't mention that hateful man. It's the hardest thing in the world to accept the fact that your property is not left to your own children, and I'm sure, if I were you, I'd have tried to do something about it."
Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain the legal situation to her again. They had often attempted to do this before, but it was a matter which Mrs. Bennet refused to understand, and she continued to complain bitterly about Mr. Collins. "It certainly is most unjust," agreed Mr. Bennet, "and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting this house. But if you listen while I read his letter to you, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself." He read aloud the following letter. "Dear Sir, the disagreement between you and my late respected father always worried me, and since his death I have frequently wished to improve the relationship between our families. After a long period of study and training, I have recently become a priest, and have been fortunate enough to gain the patronage of Lady Catherine de Burgh, widow of Sir Lewis de Burgh. This generous lady has given me the post of rector at Hunsford, which was luckily vacant. Hunsford is the village near her own large country house in Kent. Here I carry out the duties of my profession whenever necessary, and I take great care to behave at all times with grateful respect towards her ladyship. As a priest, moreover, I feel it my duty to encourage all families in my area of influence to live peacefully. Because of this, I flatter myself that I am acting correctly in offering you my friendship. I am, of course, concerned that when I eventually inherit all your property, your daughters will doubtless be very poor, and I do apologize for this. I promise you I am ready to make amends in every possible way, but more about this later. If you do not object, I propose to visit you and your family on Monday, November the 18th at 4 o'clock, and shall probably stay until the following Saturday week. This will cause me no inconvenience at all, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence from my duties. I remain, dear sir, with respectful good wishes to your lady and your daughters, your friend, William Collins." "So we can expect this peacemaking gentleman at 4 o'clock today," said Mr. Bennet as he folded up the letter. "He appears to be a most polite and serious young man. How considerate of Lady Catherine to allow him to visit us."
"Well, if he is ready to make amends to the girls in some way, I shall certainly not discourage him," said Mrs. Bennet. "Although it's difficult," said Jane, "to guess how he intends to do that. It's good of him to want to help us." "I think he's peculiar," said Elizabeth. "He sounds too pleased with himself, and he speaks so politely of Lady Catherine. And why does he apologize for inheriting father's property in future? We know it's not his fault. Can he be a sensible man, sir?" she added, turning to Mr. Bennet.
"No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the opposite. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises to be entertaining. I am impatient to see him." Mary, the middle daughter, who spent most of her time reading and who seldom joined in family conversation, now remarked that in her opinion his letter was well expressed. But Kitty and Lydia did not show any interest in the letter or its writer. As it was highly unlikely that their cousin would arrive in a regimental uniform, they could not imagine having any pleasure in meeting him. Their mother, however, had changed her attitude towards Mr. Collins after his letter, and was now preparing to meet him with such calmness that it astonished her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins arrived punctually, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins did not seem in need of encouragement. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His expression was serious, and his manners very formal. Soon after his arrival, he said to Mrs. Bennet, "Madam, I must compliment you on having such a fine family of daughters. I had heard much of their beauty, but I find them even more beautiful than reports have stated. I do not doubt you will see them all well married quite soon." Mrs. Bennet never quarrelled with compliments, and she answered, "You are very kind, sir, and indeed I do hope so, because otherwise they'll have nothing at all to live on." "You refer, perhaps, to my inheriting the Bennet property?" "Ah, yes, sir, I do. You must confess it is a sad business for my poor girls." "I am very aware, madam, of the hardship to your lovely daughters, and could say more about this, but I am cautious of saying too much too soon. But I would like to say that I have come prepared to admire the young ladies, and perhaps when we know each other better—" The bell rang for dinner, and the family moved into the dining-room with their guest. The girls smiled secretly at each other as Mr. Collins praised the hall, the dining-room, and all the furniture. Mrs. Bennet would normally have been delighted with such praise, but she could not help thinking that he was perhaps admiring it all as his future property. The dinner, too, he considered excellent, and he asked which of his charming cousins was responsible for it. But Mrs. Bennet explained quite sharply to him that they were very well able to afford a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged her pardon immediately for offending her, and continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. Mr. Bennet had hardly spoken up to now, but he thought it was time to enter the conversation. "You seem very fortunate in your patron, Mr. Collins," he said. He could not have chosen a better opening remark. Mr. Collins spoke enthusiastically for several minutes in praise of Lady Catherine. "Never in my life have I witnessed such considerate behaviour in a person of high birth. Although she is such a great lady, she has never treated me with disdain. She talks to me almost as an equal, and gives me advice. For example, she has recommended me to marry as soon as possible. And do you know, she has asked me to dinner twice at her house. Some people consider her proud, but she has only ever been kind to me. She even took the trouble to visit my small house, and was thoughtful enough to suggest 1 or 2 improvements, some shelves upstairs." "That is very correct and polite, I'm sure," said Mrs. Bennet. "Does she live near you, sir?" "Only a small country road separates my poor house from Rosings Park, her ladyship's home." "I think you said she is a widow. Has she any family?" "She has only one daughter, who will inherit Rosings and all Lady Catherine's property, a most charming young lady, unfortunately in weak health. I often pay her some little compliment on her appearance or her accomplishments when I visit Rosings. Lady Catherine appreciates these compliments to her daughter, and I see it as my duty to please her ladyship." "I am sure you're right," said Mr. Bennet. "No doubt you are expert at flattering with delicacy. May I ask how you think of these pleasing compliments?" "Some of them come to me at the time, but in my spare moments I do occasionally prepare a few words which may be suitable for different occasions." Mr. Bennet listened to his cousin with the greatest enjoyment. Mr. Collins was as foolish as he had hoped. But by tea-time Mr. Bennet had had enough, and after tea asked his guest to read aloud to the ladies. However, when a novel was handed to Mr. Collins, he looked shocked, and protested that he never read novels. He chose a religious book instead, and started reading in a slow, serious voice. Lydia could not hide her boredom for long, and after only 3 pages she interrupted him rudely to ask her mother a question about one of the officers in Meryton. Mr. Collins was offended and refused to read any more, although Mrs. Bennet and her other daughters apologised for Lydia's lack of manners. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and neither education nor society had improved him. The respect he felt for his patron, and his very good opinion of himself and his new position, made him proud and servile at the same time. Now that he had a home and a considerable income, he had decided to marry. The Bennet girls, who would lose their inheritance because of him, had a reputation for being attractive and charming, and his idea of making amends to them was to marry one of them. He considered this an excellent plan, and thought himself extremely generous and unselfish in carrying it out. He had known he was right when he arrived at Longbourn and saw Jane Bennet's lovely face. As the eldest, she should marry first, and for the first evening she was his choice. But the next morning, after a 15-minute conversation with Mrs. Bennet, he had to change his mind. When he explained that he was hoping to find a wife among her daughters, she replied with a happy smile that her eldest daughter was very likely to be engaged soon. "But there are my other daughters, Mr. Collins," she continued encouragingly. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done while Mrs. Bennet was pouring the tea. Next to Jane in birth and beauty, Elizabeth was the obvious choice. Mrs. Bennet was delighted, hoping that she might soon have 2 daughters married. The man whom she had so disliked the day before was now a favourite with her. Chapter 4. Elizabeth meets Mr. Wickham. When later that morning Lydia suggested walking to Meryton to see some of the officers, all her sisters except Mary agreed to accompany her. Even Mr. Collins went with them, encouraged by Mr. Bennet, who was by now most anxious to have some time to himself. During their walk, the girls listened politely to Mr. Collins' self-important speeches. But as soon as they entered Meryton, the younger ones no longer even pretended to be interested in his conversation, but looked eagerly around in search of the officers. Just then, all the young ladies noticed a very gentlemanlike young man whom they'd never seen before, walking down the street with an officer they knew. They were all wondering who the handsome stranger could be, when the officer came up to them to greet them. He asked permission to introduce his friend, whose name was Mr. Wickham, and who had apparently arrived recently from London to become an officer in the regiment. This was exactly as it should be, because the young man only needed an officer's uniform to become completely charming. He was very good-looking, with a very pleasant, sociable manner, and after the introductions, conversation flowed most enjoyably in the little group. They were still standing and talking happily together when they heard the sound of horses and saw Darcy and Bingley riding down the street. The 2 gentlemen came straight towards the ladies to greet them. Bingley was clearly most interested in Jane Bennet, and started talking particularly to her. Darcy, however, was just determining not to look at Elizabeth, when he suddenly noticed the stranger. By chance, Elizabeth saw Darcy's and Wickham's faces at the moment when they caught sight of each other, and she was astonished at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour, one white, the other red. After a few moments, Mr. Wickham touched his hat, and Mr. Darcy nodded very slightly. What could this mean? It was impossible to imagine, and it was impossible not to wish to know. In another moment, Mr. Bingley, who did not seem to have noticed what had happened, said good-bye and rode away with Mr. Darcy. The 2 officers accompanied the young ladies to Mrs. Phillips's house, but did not go in spite of Lydia's repeated invitations. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and welcomed Mr. Collins most politely when he was introduced to her. She did not, however, have any more information for the girls about the agreeable Mr. Wickham. "But I tell you what, my dears," she said brightly, "I'm giving a little supper party for some of the officers tomorrow. I'll ask Mr. Phillips to visit Mr. Wickham and invite him to come too. Will you all come as well?" The girls were delighted, and agreed at once to this arrangement, and the whole group walked back to Longbourn, happily discussing the enjoyable evening they were going to have. Mr. Collins had been very impressed with Mrs. Phillips's politeness, and when they reached Longbourn he complimented Mrs. Bennet on her sister's elegance and charming manners. The next evening the carriage took him and his 5 cousins to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the hall, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation and was at that moment in the house. When Mr. Collins was shown into the sitting-room, and had time to look around and admire it, he said immediately to Mrs. Phillips, "Madam, I must compliment you on the size and furniture of this room. Really, I could almost imagine myself in the smaller summer breakfast-room at Rosings." This remark did not at first please his hostess very much, but when she heard from him what Rosings was, and who its owner was, and how much Lady Catherine's furniture cost, she realized what a great compliment it was. During the evening, Mr. Collins found Mrs. Phillips a kind and attentive listener, which was fortunate, as the Bennet girls could not bring themselves to listen to him any longer. All the ladies were impatient to see Mr. Wickham, and when he came into the room he appeared far more charming and gentlemanly than any of the officers present. He was the lucky man towards whom almost every female eye turned, and Elizabeth was the lucky woman beside whom he finally took his seat. His pleasant way of making conversation made her feel that he could talk interestingly about anything. As he did not play cards, which some of the party were doing, he stayed talking to Elizabeth for a large part of the evening. She hoped he would tell her how he knew Mr. Darcy, but she dared not mention that gentleman. Luckily, however, Mr. Wickham himself began to talk about it, although in a rather hesitating manner. "Netherfield is quite near Meryton, I suppose. How long has Mr. Darcy been staying there?" "He has been there about a month," replied Elizabeth. Unwilling to let the matter drop, she added, "He is a man of very large property in Derbyshire, I understand." "Yes," replied Wickham. "His income is 10,000 a year at least. I know more about him than most people, as I've been closely connected with his family since childhood." Elizabeth could only look surprised. "You might well be surprised, Miss Bennet, at my saying that, after noticing, as you probably did, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Do you know Mr. Darcy well?" "As well as I ever wished to," cried Elizabeth. "I've spent 4 days in the same house as him, and I consider him very disagreeable." "I've known him too long and too well to judge fairly whether he's disagreeable or not, but I believe most people would be astonished by your opinion. He is not at all liked here in Hertfordshire. Everybody is disgusted with his pride. You won't find him praised by anyone." "I can't pretend to be sorry that he is valued as he deserves, but with him I believe it doesn't often happen. The world is blinded by his fortune and importance, or frightened by his proud behaviour, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen." After a pause, Wickham added, "I wonder if he's likely to stay at Netherfield much longer." "I don't know at all, but I hope his presence won't stop you becoming an officer in the regiment here." "Oh, no, I won't be driven away by Mr. Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. The reason I have for avoiding him is one I could easily make public to the whole world. He has treated me very badly. His late father, Miss Bennet, was one of the best men who ever lived, and the most faithful friend I ever had. And whenever I'm with this Mr. Darcy, I think of his father with the most painful regret. Mr. Darcy has behaved wickedly towards me, but I could forgive him anything except the insult to his father's memory." Elizabeth was fascinated and listened eagerly, but did not like to ask any questions. Mr. Wickham began to speak more generally about Meryton and the charming people he had met there. "In fact, that's why I was tempted to join the regiment. I'd heard that Meryton society is most agreeable. Society, I confess, is necessary to me. I have been a disappointed man, you see. I did not intend to join the army at all. The church ought to have been my profession, and I should at this moment have a comfortable income as a Derbyshire rector, if the gentleman we were speaking of just now had wished it." "Indeed?" "Yes. Mr. Darcy's father had always been very fond of me, and intended to give me the post of rector of Pemberley. But unfortunately, after his death, when the post became vacant, it was given to someone else." "No!" cried Elizabeth, horrified. "But how could that happen? Why didn't you get legal advice and claim what was rightfully yours?" Mr. Darcy's father had not stated his wish in writing. A man of honour could not have doubted his intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to treat it as a recommendation only. I really cannot accuse myself of having done anything to deserve to lose the post. The fact is, he hates me. I think he was jealous of his father's affection for me, which annoyed him from the beginning.
This is very shocking. I hadn't thought Mr. Darcy as bad as this, although I've never liked him. I assumed he felt superior to everyone else, but did not suspect him of behaving in such a wicked, unjust, inhuman way.
We grew up together at Pemberley, you know. My father gave up all his time to take care of the Pemberley farms, and was greatly appreciated as a close friend by the late Mr. Darcy, who promised, just before my father's death, to provide for me. The present Mr. Darcy did not choose to respect that promise.
How strange that Mr. Darcy's pride has not made him help you. Surely he's too proud to wish to appear dishonest, which is what I must call him.
He's certainly very proud. Proud of his position, his family, his father, and his sister too, you know.
What sort of a girl is Miss Darcy?
He shook his head. It gives me pain to criticise a Darcy, but she's too much like her brother. Very, very proud. She's a handsome girl of about 15 or 16, and I understand extremely accomplished.
I am astonished at Mr. Darcy's close friendship with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems so charming and kind, be friendly with such a man?
I don't know Mr. Bingley at all, but Mr. Darcy can be a pleasant companion if he thinks it worthwhile.
Just then they were joined by some of the others, and the conversation became more general. When Mr. Collins was talking to Mrs. Phillips about his patron, Mr. Wickham looked quickly in his direction, and then asked Elizabeth,
"Does your cousin know Lady Catherine de Bourgh very well?"
"I don't think he has known her for long, but she has recently given him the post of rector of Hunsford."
"Perhaps you know that Lady Catherine is the present Mr. Darcy's aunt. I believe she is planning to marry her daughter, who will inherit a fortune, to Mr. Darcy."
This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley's efforts to attract Mr. Darcy, which might all be in vain. The supper party came to an end, and Elizabeth went away with her head full of Mr. Wickham. She could think of nothing but him and what he had told her all the way home. The next day, she told Jane everything she had discussed with Mr. Wickham. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She could not believe that Mr. Darcy could so little deserve Mr. Bingley's friendship, and yet she did not want to doubt the truthfulness of such an agreeable young man as Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth, however, felt sure that Mr. Darcy was to blame. That morning an invitation arrived at Longbourn. Mr. Bingley had fixed the date for the ball he had promised to give at Netherfield, and it was to be on the following Tuesday. Every female in the Bennet family was looking forward to it, even Mary, who lifted her head from her book to say, unsmiling, "As long as I have my mornings free for serious reading, I do not mind meeting people in the evenings. I consider some relaxation and amusement is good for everybody." Elizabeth felt so cheerful at the thought of dancing with Mr. Wickham that she made an unusual effort to speak kindly to Mr. Collins. "Will you accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, sir? And if you do, will you, as a priest, consider it right to dance?"
"I shall certainly accept, and I am so far from objecting to dancing that I hope to have the honour of dancing with all my beautiful cousins. I take this opportunity of asking you, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances especially." She was very surprised and rather annoyed. She had hoped that Wickham would ask her for those dances, but now she would have Mr. Collins instead. She could not refuse, however, and his request also worried her in another way. His manner to her seemed particularly flattering, which gave her the unwelcome idea that perhaps she had been chosen from among her sisters to be the rector of Hunsford's wife. As she observed the increasing number of compliments he paid to her beauty and character, she felt sure that he intended to propose marriage. For the moment, however, she decided to do nothing but wait and see. On Tuesday evening, when Elizabeth entered the hall at Netherfield and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the red coats gathered there, she was surprised and disappointed to see he was not present. She had never doubted he would come, and had dressed with more than her usual care, looking forward to winning his heart, which she knew was already partly hers. But she immediately suspected that Darcy had persuaded Bingley not to invite Wickham, and although she discovered from one of the officers that in fact Wickham had been invited, but had been called away on business, she felt sure Wickham had wanted to avoid meeting Darcy, and blamed Darcy for this. As a result, when Darcy greeted her, she was so annoyed with him that she could hardly reply politely. But she soon became more cheerful, and determined to enjoy the ball in spite of Wickham's absence. Unfortunately, the first 2 dances with Mr. Collins were painfully embarrassing, as her cousin had no idea how to dance and moved extremely awkwardly. She was relieved to leave him, and have the 3rd dance with an officer, who gave her great pleasure by talking about Wickham and his popularity in the regiment. After this, she was very surprised to be approached by Mr. Darcy and invited to dance. She was so astonished, in fact, that she accepted him without thinking, and found herself standing opposite him on the dance floor. What an honour for me to be allowed to dance with Mr. Darcy, she thought. They danced for some time in silence, and then she made a remark. He replied, and was silent again. After a pause, she spoke again. "Now you must say something, Mr. Darcy. You could remark on the size of the room, or the number of couples." He smiled. "I'll say whatever you wish me to say." "Very well. That reply will do for the moment. Perhaps soon I'll observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we can be silent. Conversation needs to be arranged in this way so that those people who don't enjoy talking are not required to make any effort." "Are you referring to yourself, or are you thinking of me?" "Both," said Elizabeth, smiling, "because I think you and I are similar. We're both unsociable and unwilling to speak, unless we can astonish and impress the whole room." "I am sure you aren't like that," he answered. "I cannot say whether I am or not. You obviously think so." She said nothing. "Do you and your sisters often go to Meryton?" he continued. "We do," she replied, and unable to resist the temptation, she added, "When you met us there last week, we had just been introduced to someone." The effect was immediate. There was a new coldness in Darcy's expression. After a moment he said with difficulty, "Mr. Wickham is so agreeable that he makes friends easily. Whether he can keep them is less certain." "He has been unlucky enough to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth sharply, "and in a way which will cause him hardship all his life." Darcy did not reply to this, and there was only time for a little more conversation before the dance ended. Elizabeth went to find Jane, and listened with delight as she described her feelings for Bingley, and her confidence in his affection for her. But apart from Jane, it seemed to Elizabeth that if her family had made an agreement to appear as stupid as possible during the ball, they could not have been more successful. First, Mr. Collins insisted on going to introduce himself to Mr. Darcy, the nephew of his respected patron, and was received very coldly. Then, during supper, Mrs. Bennet could not be prevented from talking very loudly to Lady Lucas about her great hopes of Jane's marriage to Bingley. Elizabeth blushed in embarrassment when she realised that the Bingley sisters and Mr. Darcy were able to hear. Finally, when some music was required, Mary Bennet went confidently to the piano and sang and played several songs, all rather badly. The rest of the evening brought Elizabeth little amusement. She could not even go and talk to people she knew, as Mr. Collins seemed determined to stay close by her side all evening. Fortunately, her good friend Charlotte Lucas occasionally gave her some relief by kindly listening to some of Mr. Collins' long speeches. At least Elizabeth did not have to talk to Mr. Darcy any more. He often stood near her, quite alone, but did not come close enough to speak. At the end of the evening, it was obvious to Elizabeth that although her family had greatly enjoyed the ball, the Bingley sisters were eager for these particular guests to leave. Mr. Collins, however, was enthusiastic in his praise of the Bingleys' hospitality, and Mrs. Bennet invited the whole Bingley family to visit Longbourn as soon as possible. She was feeling very satisfied, convinced that in 3 or 4 months Jane would be married to Bingley. She was also sure that Elizabeth would marry Mr. Collins. This was a good enough marriage for Elizabeth, who was her least favourite daughter, but not nearly as impressive as Jane's marriage to Bingley.